Welcome to the world of Rebirth, carved in blood. In this video, we will witness the unfolding of a complete match. The purpose of this video is to demonstrate how the rules and mechanics described in the previous videos of this series are applied, and for that reason, the match has been deliberately simulated. Before we begin, let's see how a match is set up. Players place their main deck and resource deck in their player zone, keeping them well apart. Players then determine who will be the first player, the one who starts playing first. They can do this by rolling a die or flipping a coin. After that, starting with the first player, each player draws 6 cards from their main deck. Next, still starting with the first player, players choose whether to keep or change their starting hand. If they choose to change it, they must place a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 6 cards face down in front of them and draw an equal number of cards from the main deck. Finally, players shuffle the face down cards in front of them back into their main deck. Now, let's briefly go over the 7 phases that make up a turn. In the harvesting phase, the player obtains a Nocturnus resource card from their resource deck. In the planning phase, the player draws a card from their main deck. In the first organization phase, the player can play cards and perform transmutations. In the supremacy phase, for each area of the battlefield where the player's allies have supremacy, they can gain resources and resolve attacks. In the second organization phase, the player can once again play cards and perform transmutations. In the intervention phase, the player unlocks all their cards. Finally, in the victory condition check phase, the player checks if the opponent has won the match. The first player takes the first turn. In the harvesting phase, they search their resource deck for a Nocturnus card and place it in their player zone, unlocked. The first player always skips the planning phase during the first turn, so they proceed directly to the first organization phase. The player decides to play the Slayer card Emeria in Main Street, the central area of the battlefield. To do so, they pay its cost by locking a Nocturnus resource card. Slayer cards always enter the battlefield locked. Since the only card under the player's control is locked, the formation power of the allied formation in this area is 0. In the supremacy phase, the allied formation does not have supremacy in any area of the battlefield, so the player doesn't gain resources or resolve attacks. In the subsequent phase, the second organization phase, the player doesn't have any unlocked resource cards to use for playing other cards. They then move to the intervention phase, where they unlock their locked cards. Now, the allied formation in Main Street has a formation power of 1, which corresponds to the power of Emeria, now unlocked. In the final phase of the turn, the victory condition check phase, the player doesn't lose the match as the opposing formation doesn't have supremacy in any area of the battlefield. The second player obtains a Nocturnus resource card. Then, they draw a card from their main deck. In the first organization phase, they decide to play the Slayer card Eloise in Courtyards. The allies of the second player also do not have supremacy in any area, so they don't gain resources or resolve attacks during their supremacy phase. After unlocking their cards, the formation power of the allied formation in Courtyards becomes 2. The enemy formation has supremacy in only one area at the end of the second player's turn, so the game continues. The first player obtains a Nocturnus card and draws a card from their main deck. The player decides not to play any cards during their first organization phase and proceeds directly to the supremacy phase. In this phase, their allies have supremacy in the central area, so the player can obtain a resource card other than Nocturnus from their resource deck. However, they cannot resolve attacks as there are no enemy or neutral characters in this area. They choose to obtain an Impure Amnion card and place it in their player zone. In the second organization phase, they play the Slayer card Blake in Courtyards by paying its cost. Then they decide to transmute the card by paying its transmutation cost, and placing a transmutation token on it. This action activates Blake's transmutation triggered ability. The ability allows them to deploy 3 spawned cards called Slayer Apprentice in the same area as Blake. These spawned cards function as Slayer cards with 1 health point and a power of 1. After unlocking their cards in the intervention phase, the formation power of the allied formation in Courtyards becomes 6, which is the sum of the power values of the 4 deployed cards. The enemy formation does not have supremacy in any area, so the game continues. The second player obtains a Nocturnus card and draws a card from their main deck. In the first organization phase, they choose to play the Slayer card, Cain, in Courtyards, to counter the enemy's dominance in the area. This action triggers Cain's appearance ability, allowing the player to search their deck for an Abomination card, with a cost equal to or less than 2, and put it into play in the area as a neutral character. The player chooses the Abomination card, Darkscale Oppressor. This card has no abilities and has a power of 6. The player doesn't gain any advantages during the supremacy phase, and cannot play any other cards, so they move to the intervention phase. In the final phase of the turn, the enemies have supremacy only in Main Street, as in Courtyards, their formation power is equal to that of the neutral formation. Therefore, the game continues. The first player obtains their third Nocturnus card and draws a new card from the main deck. Firstly, the player chooses to play an Abomination card, Herald of the Impure Blood, in Town Square, triggering its appearance ability. This ability allows the player to obtain an Impure Amnion resource card from their resource deck. Then, the player plays the Slayer card, Honor, in Courtyards. This card has an ability that grants a power token every time the player plays a card. During the supremacy phase, the allied formation has supremacy only in Main Street, and the player decides to obtain a Dark Amnion resource card. After unlocking their cards, the formation power of the allied formation in Courtyards becomes 8. The game continues with the opponent's turn. The second player obtains a Nocturnus card and draws a card from their main deck. They then choose to play an Abomination card, Herald of Famine, in Courtyards, which allows them to obtain a Dark Amnion resource card. This card increases the formation power of the neutral formation in this area to 8. They subsequently play an Abomination card, Ebony Lake Horror, in Main Street. By doing so, they trigger the card's ability, which allows them to choose and discard a card from the opponent's hand. They choose to discard the Slayer card, Harmony. Once again, they cannot gain any advantages during this turn's supremacy phase. In the second organization phase, they decide to play the Slayer card, Lucero, and then they move to the intervention phase. As in the previous turn, the enemy formation maintains supremacy only in Main Street, so the game continues. Once again, the first player obtains a Nocturnus card and draws a card from the main deck. In the first organization phase, they choose to play the Slayer card, Leonard, in Main Street. Then, they choose to transmute Emeria, temporarily increasing the formation power of the allied formation in the area to 3. Since they played a card this turn, they trigger Honor's ability, which grants it a power token. They then decide to play the Slayer card, Heinrich, in Main Street, causing Honor to gain a second power token. Afterwards, they choose to transmute Leonard, triggering its transmutation ability. Through this ability, they can assign a power token to an ally in the area, and they choose to give it to Emeria. Moving on to the supremacy phase, the allied formation in Main Street has supremacy and can resolve an attack against the neutral formation. To resolve the attack, the player must divide their unlocked allies in the area into groups. However, only one card meets these requirements, so the player can create only a single group consisting solely of Emeria. This allows the player to destroy an abomination card in Main Street, with a power lower than the sum of the power values of the cards in the group. In this case, that value coincides with Emeria's power, which is 4. Therefore, the player destroys the only neutral character present in this area, the abomination card, Ebony Lake Horror, which is placed in the opponent's discard pile. The player then chooses to obtain another Dark Amnion resource card and places it in their player zone. Subsequently, the player checks the other areas and finds that the allied formation in Courtyards also has supremacy in the area. In this case, they choose to attack the enemy formation, controlled by the opponent. Since the formation power of the allied formation is 10 and that of the enemy formation is 5, the opponent must assign 5 wound tokens to their allies in the area. Cain and Eloise have 3 and 2 health points respectively, so the second player is forced to assign 3 wound tokens to Cain, and 2 wound tokens to Eloise. Both cards are destroyed, because their health points are no longer greater than the number of wound tokens on them. The opponent then puts the 2 cards into their own discard pile. The first player then moves to the intervention phase, and unlocks their cards. In this case, they made a mistake as the supremacy in Courtyards gave them the opportunity to obtain another resource card. In Rebirth, Carved in Blood, such oversights can be costly, and it's important to always keep in mind the advantages that can be gained from various gameplay situations. The second player obtains their 4th Nocturnus card and draws a card from their main deck. Their situation is quite critical, but a few moves are enough to turn the game around and tilt it in their favor. First, the player chooses to transmute their Slayer card, Lucero, triggering its transmutation ability. The ability allows them to destroy an abomination card in the area with a cost of 2 or lower. Lucero will then gain power tokens equal to the power of the destroyed card. The only valid target is the abomination card, Herald of the Impure Blood, so Lucero gains 2 power tokens. The player then moves to the supremacy phase, and thanks to the previous move, the allied formation in Town Square has supremacy. They choose to obtain a corrupted Amnion resource card. They then decide to play an abomination card, Sprouted Aberration, in Courtyards, increasing the power of the neutral formation to 10. Additionally, the player draws a card due to the ability of the Just Played Abomination card. Unfortunately, the player has no other cards to play and is forced to end their turn. However, the game is not yet over as the enemy formation has supremacy only in Main Street. The first player obtains their last Nocturnus card and draws a new card from the main deck. Having played aggressively, the player now has few cards left to play. First, the player chooses to play the Slayer card, Freya, in Town Square. Then, the player decides to play the Slayer card, Edmund, in the same area. This action triggers Edmund's appearance ability, allowing the player to deploy a Slayer Apprentice card. By playing 2 cards, Honor gains 2 power tokens. Moving to the supremacy phase, the allied formation has supremacy in Main Street, and the player chooses to obtain an Impure Amnion card. Thanks to the 2 power tokens just obtained by Honor, the allied formation also has supremacy in Courtyards. In this case, the player chooses to attack the neutral formation. First, the player divides their unlocked allies in this area into groups. Then, for each group, they will destroy a neutral character, with a power lower than the sum of the power values of the cards in that group. The first group created by the player consists of Honor and one of the Slayer apprentices, with a total power of 7. This group is used to destroy the Abomination card, Darkscale Oppressor, with a power of 6. The second group, consisting solely of Blake, allows the destruction of the Abomination card, Sprouted Aberration, with a power of 2. Finally, the last group, formed by the remaining 2 Slayer apprentices, has a total power of 2. Since the last remaining neutral character, the Herald of Famine, also has a power of 2, the group cannot destroy it. The 2 recently destroyed Abomination cards are placed in the opponent's discard pile. In the second organization phase, the player chooses to transmute Freya. After unlocking the cards, the formation power of the allied formation in Town Square becomes 14. This is because Freya's Leader 3 ability increases the power of other allies in the area by 3. The first player now has supremacy in all areas of the battlefield, and the turn passes to the opponent. The second player obtains their last Nocturnus card and draws a card from the main deck. Despite still having several cards to play, it is now very challenging to resolve the situation that has arisen on the battlefield. First, the player decides to play the Slayer card, Danica, in Courtyards, triggering its ability. The ability forces the Abomination card, Herald of Famine, to become a player's ally, and the card thus moves to the allied formation in the area. The player then chooses to deploy Diana in Courtyards, triggering its Appearance ability. The ability allows the player to search their main deck for an Abomination card and put it into play in the area. The chosen card is Grave Desecrator, whose ability increases the power of Abomination cards in the area by 1. In the intervention phase, the formation power of the allied formation in Courtyards becomes 10. In the final phase of the turn, the enemy still have supremacy in all areas of the battlefield, and the opponent wins the game. And that concludes our video series. We extend our deepest thanks for being a part of this journey and for supporting our game. Stay tuned to our social media channels for the exciting announcement of the Kickstarter campaign kickoff.